Cool. All right. So, yeah, hopefully the quiz went okay. Sorry if it's not too bad. Hopefully it's kind of straightforward after you got some use with the anatomy. Um, any questions or anything like that? All right. So let's talk a little bit about your exam. Okay. Exam 3. So it's going to go down Monday, per usual. Standard stuff. You guys have been through this, a couple times already. So I'll just kind of breeze through this. Still same amount of time. So class will begin at 9:45. Again, once you finish your exam, you are more than welcome to, head out, come back, whatever, do whatever. Just make sure you're back by 9:45 so we can start Hemopath. One question at a time, no backtracking, that kind of standard stuff. Yeah. Topics for the exam will be Hemophys, Homopatho, Cardiophys, and Cardiopatho. So lungs and heart. In terms of questions, so being completely honest here, I have not written your guys' exam yet. It's on my to-do list. It's going to happen this week. I just don't have the exact details worked out. So if I was thinking about, you have one short answer. Anywhere between, I think like 4 to 5. So I'll say like 5 just in case. Short answer. But these short answers are kind of like fill in the blank. So those short answers, it's like one word. So that means you're looking at, give or take, 35 multiple choice. So somewhere around there. Yeah. Actually, let's do that. So any questions about the exam, what to expect? No? Pretty standard? Nothing too crazy? Yeah, so I would say tips for this exam, really pay attention to how the lungs and the hearts are connected, or the lungs and the heart. Remember, if we change something in one area, how's that going to affect the other, vice versa? Okay. Shunting is kind of pretty important there. Pressures, your cardiac anatomy, so blood flow, forward, backwards. Yeah. All right. But if anybody has questions along the way, just let me know. Okay. So, awesome. So today we will start Hemophys. So this will be the start of Unit 4. This is actually my personal favorite unit because it's the most straightforward and it's blood and guts. It's interesting to me, I guess. So you know how you guys have a quiz next Tuesday? It'll be over Hemophys and Hemopath. I'll tell you that quiz is about 70% phys. Okay, so that quiz the day after the exam will mostly be off of this lecture. I don't remember what quiz number that is though. All right. So here is kind of like a breakdown of your blood, the different parts, etc. You don't need to know these numbers in absolute, just kind of general trends here. So if you notice your blood is more than half of your blood is made of plasma, i.e. that plasma is mostly water. So what I'm trying to get at here is the main component to your blood needs to be water. The main component of your blood needs to be water. Why?
Well,
Why not like cells?
I was just gonna say we're 60% water. I think that might be too basic of an answer, though.
No, you are true. We are basically 60% water. But why?
And maybe so that it's not too thick to run, or like too thick to go through our veins and capillaries, whatever.
Yeah, that's perfect. This is to allow blood to flow. Okay. So the main component of your blood should be water, should be fluid, or else your blood doesn't flow. Exactly. Okay. Now, in that fluid part right there, you do have some bits and bobs to it, which we've already talked about. So this is a bit of a review. Take, for example, albumin. Anybody remember, what does albumin, what is that all about?
It helps control both capillary and interstitial hydrostatic pressure, or no, oncotic osmotic pressure.
Oncotic pressure, absolutely. And where was albumin made?
In the liver.
Capillary oncotic, nice. And it's, let me say, made at the liver. Awesome. Okay, next up, globulins. You heard of globulins before as well. These are your immunoglobulins. What are your immunoglobulins?
Your antibodies.
Nice, these are the antibodies. Anybody remember the cells that make antibodies?
Isn't it your B memory cell? Your B,
Close.
you know, it's your B cells.
It is your B cells, yeah, your B plasma.
Like B plasma, that's right.
Very good, very good. Just the opposite of memory, very good. Okay, and the new one that we're going to introduce is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen, that's involved in clotting. Okay, so what you're going to notice with hematology, remember all those white blood cells that we talked about in the inflammatory and in the adaptive immune systems? They're coming back. Okay. Now, so that is the fluid component of your blood. Now let's talk about the cellular component. You have three types of cells: platelets, leukocytes, and red blood cells. By far, the main cellular component is your red blood cells. What do we use red blood cells for?
Transporting oxygen.
Yeah, oxygen transport, exactly. So again, pay attention to the wording here. The main component of blood should be water. The main cellular component of blood should be red blood cells. Okay, so there's a difference between the main component and the main cellular component. So be careful there. Okay. All right, so blood, hey, it does a bunch of different things. You probably already know this, so we're just going to skip this here. Okay, so your blood, you got approximately about 6 quarts or 5.5 liters-ish. It kind of depends on body size, so that number is not hugely important. But you have your plasma, which is that fluid, plasma proteins, which we just talked about, and then you have your cells. Okay, so starting off with the flat plasma, that is the fluid component. This is what allows blood to flow. Okay. So you make sure again that the main component should be water. In fact, 90% of your blood is water. Okay. Now the different plasma proteins we just touched on here. Albumin controls the plasma oncotic pressure, and that was made at the liver. Globulins, so your immunoglobulins, your antibodies, those were made at your B plasma cells. And then clotting factors, the new one that we're introducing here. Clotting factors, mainly fibrinogen. These are going to be made at the liver. So let me kind of give you guys a pretty big foreshadowing hint. The central linchpin to the entire unit 4, the biggest thing that connects everything, is the liver. Okay, so pay particular attention whenever the liver comes up, because the liver does a lot of different things. Okay, so I would say, like, there's not one slide that talks about everything that the liver does. It's scattered throughout all 4 lectures. If I were you, I'd probably start like a separate sheet and just write down things that the liver does. It's going to be the central linchpin for this entire unit. Okay. All right. So talking about your cells here, pretty straightforward on this one. Hopefully you guys have heard of these, right? Erythrocytes, what are those?
Red blood cells.
Perfect. Red blood cells. Leukocytes.
White blood cells.
And thrombocytes.
Platelets.
Yeah. Platelets. Okay. So here are all of your cells playing along, kind of. All right. So when it comes to hematology, when it comes to talking about blood, you got to know your Latin. Flat out, you have to know your Latin. If you know your Latin, it's going to be so much more helpful, especially when it comes to hematology, because it gives you a starting point. It's so important. What I ended up doing is I collected all of the Latin and kind of put it on one slide here to kind of help us organize everything. Okay. So going through the top half is just the prefixes. So erythro, straightforward, that's red. Leukeo, that's white. Thrombo, platelets. Okay. Now, anybody ever hear of the term macro? If something is macro, what does that mean?
Large.
Perfect. Therefore, micro must mean small. Hyper. This one should sound very familiar.
Increase.
Increase. Perfect. You say increased, increased or elevated. Hypo, therefore, means decreased / lowered. Poly. Anybody remember poly?
Multiple.
Yeah, multiple, or I'm going to say many here. Multiple works. Normo. God, he's so normo. Just normal. Don't overthink this one. Okay. So those are your prefixes. Now, when it comes to your suffixes, so these are the endings, okay? First up is cytic. I want you to be very careful between cytic and cytosis. They look very similar, but they are not the same thing. So be careful. A lot of students get these confused, okay? Cytic refers to size. Okay. Anybody remember what osis means?
Condition of.
Nice, a condition of, and then cyto. What would cyto mean?
Cells.
So perfect. This is a condition of cells. i.e., this person is making too many cells. Okay. Now, next up, pinia. All right, this is the way I remember pinia. If you guys look at pinia, it is one letter away from penis. And what do we think of penis? I agree. I seem to find it lacking in my life. See, you guys will never forget it. Again, that's just the way I remember it. You know, if you have a better way of doing it, you go for it. Chromic, referring to chrome or hue, that refers to color. And then themia. Themia means too many. So this is just all of the Latin like in one place here, but here's a couple of examples to kind of help us work with it. Okay, so first up, starting with cytosis. What did cytosis mean?
Too many cells.
Perfect. Too many cells. Okay, so if we look at erythrocytosis, what's the issue there?
Too many red blood cells.
Perfect. Too many red blood cells. Leukocytosis, too many white blood cells. Thrombocytosis, too many platelets. So here's some critical thinking questions for you. Erythrocytosis, is that physiological or pathological? If somebody has too many red blood cells, let me back up. The context here, an average person living an average life. Erythrocytosis, good or bad?
Bad,
Why?
because it makes blood thicker, doesn't it?
Exactly. So this would be pathological because the blood is too thick. Okay. What about leukocytosis? If someone's lab report shows elevated white blood cells, what does that indicate to you?
Disease.
Yeah, you guys got it. It indicates an infection. So in response to an infection, if you saw leukocytosis, physio or patho?
It's physio.
Agreed. Okay, so you guys notice what I'm getting at here. Just because something's elevated, it doesn't mean that it's good, and it doesn't mean that it's bad. It just depends on the context. Okay. Thrombocytosis. If I produce way too many platelets. Now, in theory, if I never get hurt, if I never fall down, I never have a scrape, no problem. But is that realistic to go through life completely unscathed? Not really. So if I have too many platelets, do you guys think that would be physio or patho?
Pathological,
Why?
because you could make clots.
Exactly. Those clots are going to be huge, right? Because we actually talked about this. This is part of that Virchow's triad. This is that hypercoagulable state. It would not be beneficial to produce more platelets than the average person. Okay. So again, when it comes to these blood conditions, know your Latin, look at the context. Okay. All right, everybody's favorite, pinia. What's that all about?
Lacking.
Yeah. Okay. So erythropenia, pretty straightforward, right? That's, let me put it over here. Lacking red blood cells, lacking white blood cells, lacking platelets. What's another term that we can use for erythropenia? What do we call somebody if they have if they're lacking red blood cells? What do we call it?
Anemia.
Nice. Anemia. So erythropenia slash anemia, physio or patho?
Patho.
Generally pathologic. What do we call somebody with leukopenia? What do we call someone lacking white blood cells?
Aren't that, isn't that an indicator of like cancer?
It can be, absolutely. Can be. Cancer is kind of like a byproduct.
Immunocompromised.
Yeah. So another way to say leukopenia is that immunocompromised or immunodeficient or immunosuppressed, which can result from cancer. Okay. The thrombocytopenia, we're not going to get there yet. We're going to talk about clotting at the end of this lecture here, but that can be, for an example, very similar to hemophilia. Okay. Chromic. So chromic refers to color. Now, what blood cell is the only blood cell with color?
Red.
Perfect. And how do red blood cells get their red color?
Iron. Well, hemoglobin.
You got it. You got it.
Right.
Yeah,
Correct.
the iron attached to the hemoglobin. Sorry, ran out of room there. Okay. So chromic refers to color, i.e. chromic is a measure of a red blood cell's hemoglobin content. So if something has normochromic, what does that tell you about this red blood cell's hemoglobin content?
It's good.
It's good. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to say good hemoglobin. Hypochromic. What would you anticipate a cell that, let's just say, what would the cell look like if it was hypochromic? How would you describe it?
It'd be pale.
Yeah, perfect. It'd be kind of pale. So I'm going to say low hemoglobin. Perfect. Notice there's no such thing as hyperchromic. Your cell cannot be too red. Worst case scenario, if your cell is too red, you're just carrying more oxygen. Your life will be great. Okay. Now, cytic. Cytic was size. Microcytic refers to small size. I can't read. Sorry. Macrocytic refers to large size. Microcytic, small size. Normocytic, just right. Okay, so let's put this all together in an example. Patient is diagnosed with macrocytic hypochromic anemia. You see what I'm talking about? Like, hey, hematology is just Latin. If you know your Latin, you'll be okay. So let's start with, which blood cell does this pertain to? Macrocytic hypochromic anemia.
Red blood cells.
It does, yeah. How'd you know?
Because it said hypochromic, so color.
Perfect. Yeah. So let's kind of translate this a little bit. Whenever you see these crazy pathologies, just translate it. Macrocytic, large size. Hypochromic, low hemoglobin. Anemia just means lack of blood. So you know that this is going to be affecting a person's red blood cells. Follow-up question would be, what do their cells look like?
Probably like
Kinda
a
straight.
pale pink.
Yeah, they'd be pale / pink. And one more.
Large in size.
Perfect. They would be large size. Okay. So you guys kind of get what I'm getting at here is know your Latin. You guys already hear me say this enough, but knowing your Latin will really help. Okay. All right. So we're going to be talking about the different cells now. Starting with your erythrocytes, your red blood cells. Hey, it is the most abundant cell in the body. You remember when I told you your red blood cells make up the majority of the cellular component. Okay. Responsible for tissue oxygenation, cool, biconcavity, and reversible deformity. So this kind of brings up a conversation. There are 4 properties that make a red blood cell good for carrying oxygen. There are 4 properties that make a red blood cell good for carrying oxygen. Okay, first property was just mentioned here, that biconcavity. Biconcavity, there are 2 concaves. So if you look at the side of a red blood cell, there's 2 divots there. How does that help a red blood cell carry oxygen?
It kind of holds it like a bowl.
Yeah, it does. It does kind of hold it like a bowl. Absolutely. What has more surface area, a bowl or a plate? Think about what can hold more, maybe fluid. Yeah. So when you have biconcavity, what this does is it increases surface area. When you increase surface area, that means you get increased hemoglobin. And the more hemoglobin you can carry, the more what can you carry? The more hemoglobin that you can carry, the more what can you carry?
Oxygen?
Oxygen, perfect. So being biconcave allows you to carry more hemoglobin, therefore carry more oxygen. Okay. Next up is this idea of reversible deformity. Reversible deformity. This means that basically orientation does not affect function. Orientation does not affect function. So your red blood cell can be right side up. It can be upside down. It can be stretched. It can be compressed. Doesn't matter. No matter how it's orientated, it's going to be able to carry oxygen. Does that kind of make sense? Think of it like, has anyone ever been tubing, like down a river? When you go tubing, you use a circular flotation device, yes, like an inner tube. Why? Because guess what? It works whether it be right side up or upside down. So if you get flipped, you're okay. Now, for the frat bros that decide to go tubing down a river with a unicorn raft, as soon as that thing flips over, they're screwed. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. So the idea here doesn't matter. It can be in any orientation. It will still carry oxygen. Third thing It has no organelles. Your red blood cell doesn't have any organelles, doesn't have an endoplasmic reticulum. It doesn't have a Golgi apparatus, doesn't even have a cytoskeleton. Kind of has a couple mitochondria if you're lucky. Why? Why would I want to have, well, why is that helpful? How does that help me carry oxygen if I have no organelles?
There's more room for the oxygen.
Yeah, there's more room for that hemoglobin, which more for that oxygen. Increases hemoglobin. Perfect. Now, the fourth thing is kind of like built off the third one. There's no nucleus. Your red blood cell has no nucleus. It has no brain. So part of it is it allows more hemoglobin, but also let's kind of think of it this way. If something doesn't have a brain, does that complicate its functions or simplify its functions?
It would
You have-
simplify because it wouldn't have room for error.
Exactly. Your red blood cell with no nucleus means it's going to do one thing and it's going to do that one thing well. What is that one thing that your red blood cell is going to do?
Carry oxygen.
Bingo. Okay. So fun fact, anybody a fan of like those murder mystery drama TV shows? You guys ever see like on the murder scene, there's like the blood splatter and they're swabbing the blood? Can you actually get DNA from a red blood cell? What? You can't, because there's no nucleus, there's no DNA. So why are they swabbing the wall? When they're swabbing the wall, they're not looking for red blood cells. They're looking for white blood cells. And who hangs around red blood cells? White blood cells. So fun fact, yeah, your red blood cells actually don't have DNA. Okay. Now, your red blood cells have give or take 120-day life cycle. You know, so that's give or take 3 to 4 months. We'll say just on average, like 4 months. Okay. About 4 months. Another fun fact, who has better red blood cells, males or females? Who has better, if not healthier, red blood cells?
Females.
Females. Why?
We bleed every month.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Absolutely. Menstruation. Females, you guys are dumping blood every month. Therefore, you are making new blood. In comparison, males don't have menstruation. Our red blood cells as a male is inferior. It's old, it's raggedy, it's not as new. So, yeah. Now, in order to make red blood cells, you need erythropoietin, which is abbreviated as EPO, erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone made at the kidneys. Erythropoietin is a hormone that is made at the kidneys. It is released during hypoxia. So EPO is a hormone made at the kidneys and is released during hypoxia. Now, anybody from sea level? Did anyone move here from sea level? Yeah. So when you were living at sea level and then you moved up to Colorado, how did the first couple weeks feel?
Like shit.
Yeah, it feels absolutely terrible. How did you feel? Thirsty? Lightheaded?
Yeah, I literally played in an adult field hockey league in like in 2 minutes. Almost thought I was gonna pass out. That's a horrible.
Okay. Absolutely, absolutely. Anybody else? Any other? Migraines are usually reported.
I mean, Alexis and I are from like the same place in New Jersey, so I actually didn't feel too bad when I moved out here. Surprising.
Okay. Nice, nice. So why? Why would people have trouble? So when you're at elevation here, Is there more or less oxygen?
Less.
Less. So when you're at elevation, there's less oxygen. When you go from sea level up, less oxygen, that's hypoxia. That triggers your kidneys to make more red blood cells. That triggers your kidneys to release EPO. You make more red blood cells. It takes about 2 weeks to acclimate. But now that you guys are living up here, you have more red blood cells, right? If you decide to visit family at sea level, hey, guess what? Your athletic performance is going to be better, and so will your drinking abilities. Why? Because you have more red blood cells. Again, it takes about 2 weeks there. You may have heard of EPO in the news. Not as much anymore, but it's still around. Anybody hear of EPO, particularly in the field of athletics? No? Nobody's heard of blood doping? All right, so here's the issue. If I'm an athlete, I can take EPO. I take this hormone. This is a hormone that I make. It's not a synthetic steroid. It's not a synthetic substance. It's a hormone I make. Yeah. And he's gonna come up in conversation. What would be the benefit to me injecting EPO? Why would that benefit me in terms of athletic performance?
More red blood cells, so your athletic performance goes up.
More red blood cells, greater oxygen capacity, better athletic performance. Absolutely. Lance Armstrong, you guys have heard of him, yes? Right? He is a phenomenal athlete, won the Tour de France, got cancer, lost a nut, came back more aerodynamic than ever. He was taking EPO. Now, he was taking EPO because of the cancer treatments, but did that give him an unfair advantage? Maybe. Okay, but also he was on other stuff as well. The Tour de France is a giant pharmaceutical race. I don't know if you guys knew that. Like, not ripping on cyclists, like you still have to be a hell of an athlete. Top 10 winners in the Tour de France are pharmaceutical test subjects. It's crazy. So, if EPO is released by hypoxia, keep that in mind, okay? I present to you one of the most French pictures I have ever seen in my entire life. Here is the early Tour de France. Notice these are like steel frames. What do you guys notice these people are doing?
They're smoking.
You see what I'm talking about? This is the most French a picture can get. They are smoking. Why? Okay, well, part of it is culture, absolutely. But let's think about this. People who smoke cigarettes, when you smoke a cigarette, what does that induce in the body? What condition does that cause?
Hypoxia.
It causes hypoxia. So by smoking cigarettes, they're triggering hypoxia. That triggers EPO release. They're making more red blood cells. They didn't know it at the time, but cigarettes is a form of blood doping. Now, am I going to say like, hey, go start chain smoking so you can win that marathon? No, there's better ways to do that. Okay. But in real life, applying that to today, when you guys start working with smokers who smoke cigarettes, you take them off the cigarettes and you give them a nicotine patch. They're going to feel terrible. A lot of them will develop anemia because they've been self-treating their anemia through cigarette smoking. Kind of weird. But also, I love, like, I just love the idea, like, hey, smoke a cigarette, you'll feel better. It'll open up your lungs. All right, so here is a capillary. Notice your red blood cells are in single file. Take a look at this red blood cell. It seems right side up. This one's sideways. This one's being stretched. This one's being like compressed. No matter what, these are still going to be able to carry oxygen due to what property?
Reversible deformity.
Yahtzee. Reversible deformity. Also, do you guys notice inside that capillary, it's a pretty tight squeeze, yeah? So you remember when we were talking about different sizes? If someone's red blood cell was too big, what could be a potential problem?
Traffic jam.
Traffic jam, it could get stuck, absolutely. Very good. All right, white blood cells. Hey, we've talked about these, so it goes by pretty quick, if you can remember them. So your white blood cells, fight infection, two kinds of groups. You have granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes contain grains of what?
Histamine.
Nice. Cells with grains of histamine. Anybody remember from 6 weeks ago, what was the acronym?
Ben?
Nice. Your granulocytes are Ben. Very good. Your agranulocytes, so cells without grains of histamine, that's everything else. Okay. Anything besides Ben. So, a little bit of a recap here, talking about your granulocytes. Here's Ben. Basophils. Still don't know. Whatever they do, who knows? Eosinophils. What do you guys remember about eosinophils?
They kill parasitic worm infections.
Nice. They fight parasites. And
Part of allergies too.
part of the allergies, the IgE, hypersensitivity, sure, sure. They control a very important response.
Inflammatory.
They also control inflammation. And neutrophils. Oh boy, neutrophils. What do you guys remember about neutrophils?
The first responders.
First responders, absolutely.
They're like a one and done.
Responders, one and done.
They explode and make pus.
Yep. And they produce purulent exudate. Nice work, guys. So that's your Ben. Now your agranulocytes, basically everything else, particularly your monocytes and macrophages. If you guys remember your monocytes, they're just baby macrophages. They turn into macrophages. Okay. So if you want to think of it like these are the baby form, these are the adults. Your macrophages make up the mononuclear phagocyte system, the MPS. For now, I'm just going to describe it as this is a filter. This is a filter. Okay. Then you have your lymphocytes. How many different types of T cells were there? How many different? Yeah, nice. There were 4. Cytotoxic. Oh, good. No, I have it. Cytotoxic helper. Why am I blanking?
Memory.
Thank you. Memory and regulator. Ironic that I couldn't remember memory.
Might have
B
done that on
cells.
purpose.
You got your plasma and your memory. Natural killer cells. We didn't have enough time to talk about them in immunology, so we'll skip them here. Finally, the third category here, your thrombocytes made by, or i.e. your platelets. In order to make your platelets, you need thrombopoietin, which is abbreviated as TPO. Okay, thrombopoietin, this is a hormone made at the liver. It's a hormone made at the liver. Okay. So thrombopoietin, this is going to basically stimulate platelet production. There's not necessarily a trigger for TPO. It's constantly being released. Constantly being released. Okay. A little side note here in terms of the Latin. Anytime you see poietin, that denotes the hormone. If you ever see the suffix poiesis, that's the process. Okay, so how this works, thrombopoietin is the hormone, thrombopoiesis is the process. So thrombopoietin, hormone to make thrombocytes, thrombopoiesis, process of making thrombocytes. Okay, so just, it looks similar, but two different things, poietin versus poiesis. So a little bit of a recap here. What hormone did you need to make red blood cells?
Erythropoietin.
Erythropoietin, EPO, perfect. What hormone do you need to make platelets?
Thrombopoietin.
Thrombopoietin. What hormone do you need to make white blood cells? Leukocytes. Give you a hint. It's the answer y'all are giving me right now.
Nothing.
Yes, there you go. There's no hormone for white blood cells. Why? Think of it this way. How many types of red blood cells do you have? Just one. Yeah, exactly. How many types of platelets do you have?
One? I don't know.
One. Yeah, exactly. If you're only making one type of cell, you only need one hormone. That's why you have a hormone for red blood cells. You have a hormone for your platelets. How many types of white blood cells are there?
Too many.
There's a few. I wouldn't say too many, but there's a few. Therefore, that's why there's not a singular hormone. Each white blood cell needs to be made differently. Okay, that's why there's no hormone for your white blood cells. So here is a thrombocyte. Here's a platelet. Notice its arms are outstretched. Your platelets come in two forms. An inactive form, your platelets are actually round. In an active form, i.e. when they are activated, this is when they have these long, stretchy arms. Okay. So the idea here is when your platelets activate, they grow these long arms. It's so they can grab things. They can grab other platelets. They can grab red blood cells. They can grab the vessel. They can grab inflammatory factors. Okay. So this here is your platelet. Here it is activated and it is just happy to see you. It kind of looks like it's trying to give you a hug. I'm just saying. Thank you. All right. You can't see where we're at. Yeah, let's take a pause here. And then we'll talk about making blood and all that stuff. So we'll take a pause here, let's say like 9:15. It's 10 minutes. We'll pick back up again, okay? Let me know if you guys have questions or you need me to go back to any slides. Awesome. So, okay. So now we are going to get into lymphoid organs. So we kind of talked about the lymphatics at the end of cardiophys, but kind of elaborating a little bit on it. Two types of lymphoid organs. You have primary and secondary. Primary versus secondary. Your primary lymphoid organs, so your primary organs, their job is to make and mature your lymphocytes. Make and mature your lymphocytes. So for example, does anybody remember how T cells get their name? T cells made where?
Is it the thalamus?
Close, close. It's an organ that you had as a child, but you no longer have as an adult.
The thymus.
The thymus, yeah. So the thymus is an example. The other place is your bone marrow, where your B cells are made. Okay. So we're going to elaborate on this here, but all of your blood cells actually come from your bone marrow. All of your blood cells come from your bone marrow. Okay. Your secondary organs, their job is to maintain / kill old cells. Those are really going to be your lymph nodes. So your largest secondary lymphoid organ is your spleen. So the whole purpose of the spleen there, we were talking about, is to eat old damaged blood cells. So what was the lifespan of a red blood cell again? What was the lifespan of a red blood cell?
120 days.
120 days, 4 months, give or take. When that red blood cell is old and decrepit, it's going to get to the spleen and the spleen's going to kill it. We're going to recycle that cell for parts. Same thing with your old defective T cells, old defective B cells, okay? The other thing that your spleen does is it does blood storage. It stores, give or take, about 15% of your blood. I should actually say it stores about 50% of your oxygenated blood. Okay, that this is for kind of med surg too, and like fun facts, so you don't need to write this down. The blood that's stored in your spleen is for emergencies. When would you need to, why would you need to store emergency oxygenated blood? What situation would you need that for?
In case you're bleeding out.
In case you're bleeding out, absolutely, that's one way.
If you're hypoxic.
If you're hypoxic, yeah, like if you're drowning. So when people are drowning, usually tunnel vision happens. Vision gets narrow, 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 and then there's a sudden second wind, their vision snaps back, and that's your spleen dumping that blood into your circulation to help you give you one more chance at getting oxygen. The fun fact about it, the only people that have free access to their spleens are probably Navy SEALs. Like those guys are a whole nother level. They like to handcuff one another and then throw each other into the pool and say swim. They're nuts. Okay. So talking a little bit about your lymph nodes here. Again, those that secondary organ. Okay. Your lymph nodes facilitate maturation of your lymphocytes. Again, this is as an adult when you no longer have a thymus when you no longer have a thymus. Okay. And it cleanses lymphatic fluid of microorganisms and foreign particles. This was that filter function I kind of mentioned. Okay, so your lymph nodes kind of act as a filter. So taking a look here, this is inside of your lymph node. This is actually the MPS, that mononuclear phagocytic system. MPS is basically a oh Lord, I can't today. Self-replacing filter. Okay. Because what's inside of your lymph node, this pink right here, these pinks, these are macrophages. So your MPS is a series of macrophages, i.e. your MPS is inside of your lymph nodes. Your MPS is a bunch of macrophages. So we talked about afferent lymph nodes. They bring unfiltered fluid, i.e. dirty fluid into your lymph node. These macrophages will eat the old cells. They will eat dead neutrophils. They will eat debris. And then your efferent, that's where the filtered fluid goes. Okay. Question for you. Let's take a look at, that doesn't really show up. Let's go black then. You see that one circled pink macrophage I drew? Let's assume that macrophage is old. Let's assume that macrophage is so old, it can't eat anything anymore. What do you think happens to it?
The other macrophages eat it.
The other macrophages eat it. We make new macrophages. That's why it's self-replacing. Okay. So this filter is just going to eat itself to replace itself. Okay. That's how we quote unquote clean the blood. So elaborating on that, your MPS is a series of macrophages that reside in the tissues for a very long time. These macrophages, this filter, ingest and destroy microorganisms and foreign material. So for example, when you are sick, let's say not COVID, but when you're sick with like the standard cold or something like that, what's something that you can palpate to tell if you're sick? Yeah, your lymph nodes down here underneath your jaw, yeah? When you're sick, how do your lymph nodes feel?
Swollen, large, freely
Swollen,
movable.
large? Yeah, absolutely. Why are they so swollen? These are your lymph nodes. So this is underneath your jaw. If it's filled with infected cells, if it's filled with dead neutrophils, that's what causes it to swell. That's why you can palpate it. Okay. So if you are sick and you cut open somebody's lymph node, lots of disgusting stuff is coming out. It's just showing you that the filter is kind of backed up. Okay. The two best quote unquote filters, liver and spleen. All right. So now next topic we're talking about is hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis. Poiesis refers to as the process of blood cell production. Okay. So basically we're talking about how do you make blood? Really, there's two steps to making blood. Step one, mitosis. Step two, maturation. That's it. All of your cells, all of your blood cells start as pluripotent stem cells. You guys have probably heard of stem cells before, yes? Pluripotent, pluri means multiple or plural. Potent means fates. So these stem cells have multiple fates, i.e., these stem cells can become many different types of cells. Okay. So this is just like a wow moment. Down here, these are all of your different blood cells. Those are your eosinophils, your macrophages, red blood cells, platelets, T cells, etc. All of those cells started as a pluripotent stem cell. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy that they all started as one type of cell. Now, you don't need to memorize this graph here or this flow chart, okay? But let me say, if you take this pluripotent stem cell and you expose it to erythropoietin, what kind of cell do you get?
A red blood cell.
Red blood cell. Thrombopoietin, you get platelets. Okay, white blood cells, a little bit more complicated, but holy friggin' cow, Batman. All of your blood cells come from one type of cell. Okay, where do we find the greatest amount of pluripotent stem cells? Your bone marrow. Your bone marrow. So your bone marrow basically holds all of the pluripotent stem cells. That's where you undergo mitosis. That's where you make these pluripotent stem cells. Okay. Best places to harvest bone marrow: pelvic bones and femur. You can technically harvest bone marrow from anywhere, but we're talking about when you need a large amount for things like donation. So let's kind of think about this here. I'll pick on poor Rivka, sorry. Let's say Rivka needs a bone marrow transplant, okay? And I am a good match. So I'm going to donate my bone marrow to Rivka. If I donate my bone marrow, I'm giving her pluripotent stem cells, right? So what kind of cells am I gonna be giving her? What do these cells transform into?
Whatever kind of cell she needs.
Exactly, whatever cell she needs. So what if she has anemia? If I give her bone marrow, I'm giving her the ability to make red blood cells. If she needs platelets, I'm giving her the ability to make platelets. The trippy part here, if somebody needs white blood cells, if somebody is immunocompromised, immunodeficient, and I give them bone marrow, I'm donating my entire immune system. How friggin' cool is that? Okay, so that's why bone marrow donation, like it's pretty tightly controlled and you have to match pretty well. You can't just throw your bone marrow into somebody else because you don't want my immune system to be attacking you, right? But that's the idea of a bone marrow transplant, is you're giving them the ability to make red blood cells. You're giving them the ability to clot their blood. You're giving them an entire immune system. Okay. So I know it says break time, but we'll probably just keep rolling here. Okay, so talking about making red blood cells, thankfully we've already gone through this. It goes by pretty quickly. You need erythropoietin. You need that EPO. Where did EPO come from? Where is EPO made?
The liver.
That's TPO, close.
Kidneys.
Yeah, EPO made at the kidneys. And what is the trigger for me to release EPO?
Hypoxia.
Released with hypoxia. Perfect. Okay, so you take these pluripotent stem cells, expose it to EPO, boom, you get a red blood cell. So again, you don't need to memorize this, just showing you, you have a pluripotent stem cell, you add EPO to the mix. Notice it gets smaller, smaller, nucleus gets smaller, smaller, and then boom, red blood cell. Okay. So again, we've already talked about this. This is kind of nice. Hypoxia stimulates the production and release of EPO, and your kidneys produce EPO. Boom, done. Okay. And there are your fuzzy little red donuts. They're happy to see you. All right, so hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that carries oxygen, okay? So your red blood cells, your erythrocytes need hemoglobin. Now you don't need to know this number, but just have an appreciation. A single red blood cell has 300 to 400 million hemoglobin molecules. That is a single red blood cell. Holy friggin' crap, Batman. How the hell does a single cell carry 300 to 400 million protein molecules? What allows your red blood cell to carry that many hemoglobin molecules?
Is it because of the increased surface area of it?
Increased surface area from the biconcavity, absolutely. What else allows me to carry that many molecules?
No organelles.
There's no organelles, absolutely. And following up, including there's no organelles, what organelle are we also missing?
The nucleus.
Nice. So those three things, being biconcave, having no organelles, no nucleus, that makes room for 300 to 400 million hemoglobin molecules. Okay. So just showing you guys here, this is what hemoglobin looks like. At the end of each hemoglobin molecule, you have four ends. There's that heme. Heme comes from iron. That comes from iron, okay? So that's why you may have heard of iron deficiency anemias, not enough iron, because you need 1.6 billion atoms per red blood cell. That's nuts, okay? So what do we need to make hemoglobin? Well, it's a protein. So, hey, you need protein / amino acids to make hemoglobin. Cool. You need B12 and you need folic acid. So for some of you guys, you may or may not know, I also teach nutrition. I don't want to turn this into a nutrition class. So I'm just saying, those are the two vitamins, okay? Folic acid, I'll tell you, I only refer to it as folate. So just heads up, folate and folic acid are the same thing, but I just call it folate exclusively. If you're curious, folate is also B9. It's one of your B vitamins. Okay. Why? Why do you need B12 and folate? B12 and folate give the red blood cell lifespan. B12 and folate give the red blood cell lifespan. So if you don't get enough B12, you don't get enough folate, your red blood cells, they don't make it to that 120 days. What is a great source of B12? And if you say Red Bull, you are correct, but you should not be drinking Red Bull every day. It's animal tissue. One of the best sources of B12 is animal tissue. So my vegetarians, my vegans, what are they at risk for?
Anemia.
Anemia, because the red blood cells don't live as long. Okay, we're going to elaborate on that a little bit more with hemopath, but just a little bit of foreshadowing. You need iron, obviously, for heme. Copper, this is a little bit of a side note. This is just nutrition here. You don't need to write this down. If you or someone you know is taking an iron supplement to fix their anemia, they should also be taking copper. Copper aids in iron absorption. Again, you don't need to write that down if you don't want to. That's just the life tip there. If you or someone you know is taking iron supplements to help with their anemia, try to get some copper in there too.
You just sounded like a big pharma commercial. If you or someone you know.
Side effects include having more blood. All right, so your old decrepit red blood cells are going to be sent to the macrophages of the MPS. Again, the two greatest or largest MPS systems are in the spleen and the liver. Can you live without a spleen? Oh, yes. Oh, yes, you can. Because your liver will take over if your spleen is absent. Okay, so liver and spleen. When your red blood cells are old, decrepit, they can't carry oxygen, they either go to the spleen or to the liver to be destroyed and recycled. Okay, we recycle them into basically like globin chains are broken down to amino acids. And the one I want to really want to highlight here, bilirubin. Bilirubin, this is a byproduct of red blood cell breakdown. Bilirubin is a byproduct of red blood cell breakdown. You guys have heard of bilirubin before, particularly in health assessment. If somebody has too much bilirubin, what does that indicate?
Their red
What do we?
blood cells are dying.
Yeah, red blood cells are being broke down. Absolutely. Sorry, I should.
Jaundice.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to go for. If somebody has too much bilirubin, we call it jaundice. Sorry, I should have phrased it that way. Somebody has jaundice. Jaundice that refers to the liver being broken. Yes. What if? So, Lita, I'm going to kind of take a cue from you here. What if somebody's breaking down their red blood cells too aggressively? What if somebody's just breaking down red blood cells too quickly? Would that also create jaundice? Absolutely. Yes, it would. But my liver's intact. That's weird. So what I'm getting at here, guys, be careful. Jaundice can be a sign of liver failure, but it's not always associated with the liver. Hence this right here. Let me back up here. What organ primarily breaks down red blood cells? What organ primarily breaks down red blood cells?
Spleen.
The spleen. So let's say, for example, if your spleen is overactive, if your spleen is overzealous and breaks down too many red blood cells, could you get jaundice? Absolutely. So you see what I'm saying here? You can get jaundice from A, a dysfunctional liver, makes sense, or B, an overactive spleen. We're going to elaborate on this in patho, so don't worry. But I'm just saying, hey, heads up, jaundice is not only associated with the liver. Okay. And we mentioned B12 and folate give red blood cells lifespan. All right. So those are your red blood cells. Now we're moving to your white blood cells. Again, they all start from the stem cells in the bone marrow. Your granulocytes mature in the bone marrow, i.e. Ben. Your basophils, your eosinophils, and your neutrophils all mature. So they're created and mature in the bone marrow. Your agranulocytes are released into the bloodstream before they fully mature. What was an example of me releasing a baby into the bloodstream, but then having it mature as an adult later on?
A monocyte.
Exactly. That's what I was talking about. Exactly. Monocytes, they get dumped into the blood. But then they mature as a macrophage at the site. It's a baby in the blood, and then an adult at the site. What was a pathology? What was a cardiopathology in which we saw monocytes being released into the blood, but then maturing as a macrophage at the site? What was a cardiopathology that we talked about? There's 7 steps to it.
Atherosclerosis.
Atherosclerosis is a great example. Awesome. Okay, so again, all of your blood cells come from this pluripotent stem cell. Now we're talking about your platelets, thrombopoiesis. What ends up happening is you see that it becomes a megakaryocyte, mega meaning big, karyo, that was nucleus, site cell, okay? So you have your pluripotent stem cell. What ends up happening is it starts duplicating and it looks like it's about to split into 2. So it becomes a megakaryocyte and then it shatters. Basically, it breaks up into fragments. That's how you make platelets. It sounds weird. Your cell looks like it's replicating, it's about to split, and then it shatters into a bunch of different pieces. Okay. With your platelets, again, there's 2 forms. This form on the left, the round one, is that active or inactive?
Inactive.
That's inactive. The one with the long stretchy arms, therefore, is active. Now, a little side note here, because we're going to elaborate on this in this lecture. You need calcium to activate the platelets. You need calcium to activate your platelets. Question: what electrolyte imbalance would lead to impaired platelet activation? What electrolyte imbalance would lead to impaired platelet activation?
Hypocalcemia.
Hypocalcemia, yeah. If somebody is hypocalcemic, if they don't have enough calcium, their blood may not clot because their platelets don't activate. Okay, so hopefully you guys are seeing that, like, hey, things are circling in on themselves. Okay. So platelets, you need thrombopoietin, that's your TPO. And where was TPO made again?
The liver.
Made at the liver. Nice. Your platelets only live for about 10 days. So red blood cells live on average 120 days. White blood cells depends on the type. Neutrophils obviously die pretty quickly. Memory, hopefully live a lifetime. Platelets only have 10 days. So in general, these are the shortest lived cell. In general, your platelets have the shortest lifespan. All right. So this is the third part of the lecture where we're going to get into hemostasis. Okay. Hemo, blood. Stasis, stop. Basically, we're going to get into how do you stop bleeding? Okay. You need these things here, but we're going to go over them. So that's why I'm not like highlighting them yet or even really addressing them. Okay. So I'm going to give you guys a heads up. This is the tricky part of the lecture. Okay. This is the tricky part of the lecture. I say, let's take a little break. Okay. I don't know, like just under 10 minutes, so like 9:55. We'll pick back up and then we're going to just hammer out the rest of this. Sound good? Just under 10 minutes here. So 9:55, we will finish this out. Heads up, this does get a little wonky. All right. So now we will get into hemostasis. So how do you stop bleeding? Question for you guys on your notes. Does it go 1, 2, 3? Okay, good. It finally, for like the last 7 quarters, it's been just ones all the way down, and I don't know why. So I'm glad it finally worked. So just a heads up, again, it should say step 1, 2, and 3, okay? So how do you stop bleeding? 3 steps. Step 1 is the simplest step, vasoconstriction. Why would vasospasms, vasoconstriction, why would that help you stop bleeding?
Because it doesn't allow as much blood to flow through the area.
Absolutely, that decreases perfusion, decreases blood flow, okay? Step 2 is your platelet plug. Your platelet plug, this is kind of like a temporary fix. Okay. Step 3 is now when you make a fibrin clot or a clot. This is a more stable fix. Okay. So the way I kind of think about this, step 1, vasoconstriction, that's kind of self-explanatory, right? I want you to imagine that we are on the Titanic. Okay, imagine that we're on the Titanic. You guys have probably seen the movie or at least heard of it. Okay, we just hit the iceberg. Leonardo DiCaprio has fucked off with Rose and they've stolen a door, assholes. So now we are stuck in the bottom of the boat. There's a hole in the floor and there's water coming up. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take all of the drapes, the jackets, and just shove them in the hole. That's your platelet plug. Is that going to be the fix would you trust that? Let me back up here. Would you just trust me just shoving a bunch of random stuff in the hole? That's your platelet plug, okay? Step 3 is now when I pull out the welding equipment and I start welding things to keep that hole shut. After I've welded that hole shut, it's more stable. Would you agree? Okay. After we stop bleeding, now we can initiate repair, but we're not going to be talking about wound healing, just really focusing on hemostasis, okay? So here we have a torn blood vessel and blood is leaking out. Step 1, vasoconstrict. Step 2, platelet plug. Notice your platelets are activated. They have these long stretchy arms. They grab onto different things. They grab each other. They grab red blood cells. They grab the vessel and then they jam themselves in there. That's that plug. Finally, I lay down these strands of fibrin. That is what makes a blood clot. Okay. So step 1, pretty straightforward. Spasm induces vasoconstriction, inhibits blood flow through the damaged area. Exactly as it sounds. You vasoconstrict in order to decrease perfusion. Okay. Step 1 is the easiest one. Step 2, you make your platelet plug. Now we mentioned that calcium is essential for platelet plug activation. You have to have calcium in your blood. The next thing is your platelets need to know where to go. And that is due to von Willebrand factor, the most regal sounding of factors. Sir von Willebrand tells the platelets where to go. So take, for example, here's my finger. If I cut my finger, von Willebrand factor comes from the damaged vessel. Okay, so von Willebrand factor comes from the damaged vessel wall. And this is like a homing signal. I cut my finger. That's what releases von Willebrand. That's where my platelets go. Okay, I need a plug in my finger, not my eyeball. Make sense? So 2 things, you need calcium and von Willebrand factor. Then the platelets are just going to stick to everything. That's your platelet plug. So this picture just showing you, hey, like, look, I have a torn blood vessel that releases VWF, so von Willebrand. Okay. That's what tells your platelets, oh, I need to go here and activate here. Okay. Once my activates have plugged it, now I can start making this fibrin. So this is step 3 now. This is how we make this fibrin clot. Okay. 3 different pathways that you need to be kind of aware of. Okay. So the intrinsic coagulation cascade, this is going to be triggered by exposed collagen. Okay. Now it's called the intrinsic because if you take a look at your blood vessel, the intrinsic is going to be on the inner layer. Do you guys kind of see that there? If you scratch the inner layer of the blood vessel that exposes collagen, that will be your intrinsic. That'll trigger intrinsic coagulation cascade. So this is when we have damage to the endothelium. Therefore, extrinsic is triggered by something called tissue factor. Extrinsic means we've damaged the exterior layer. If I draw it right there, hopefully you guys can see that. Extrinsic. So this is going to be triggered by damage to the tunica externa or the adventitia. You guys kind of see how intrinsic and extrinsic coagulation cascades get their name? The internal versus the external layer. Okay, question for you. If I damage my intrinsic, if I damage the endothelium, can I trigger my intrinsic coagulation cascade only? Yes. If you damage that inner layer, that can start clotting. What's an example of when we damaged the inner layer of a blood vessel and it triggered clotting? What's an example?
False aneurysm?
Close. False aneurysm, we've torn all the way through.
Arterial sclerosis.
So close. Not arterio.
Athero.
Athero. In atherosclerosis, we talked about we complicated that plaque. That plaque was the inner thing. So going back to atherosclerosis, if I damage that plaque, do I start bleeding outwards? You have a blood clot, but you're not bleeding outwardly. What I'm trying to say here, your intrinsic can fire independent of your extrinsic cascade. Your intrinsic can fire independently of your extrinsic cascade. For the example was athero. Okay. Now let's take a look at this example here with the extrinsic. So here's your blood vessel, 2 layers. If I damage my extrinsic, if I damage just the outer layer, notice my inner layer is intact. I scratch the outer layer of the blood vessel. Would I start bleeding? No. If I only damage the outer layer, I wouldn't stop bleeding. I need to tear both layers to bleed out. Would you agree? What I'm trying to say here is the extrinsic will only fire if the intrinsic fires as well. Okay, so let me kind of go back to Lita. Your example was the false aneurysm. Blood vessel, blood vessel. If I have a false aneurysm, I have a tear in this blood vessel. And hey, guess what? Blood is going to start coming out. Agreed? Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So if I have a false aneurysm, which layers have been damaged?
All of them.
All of them. The intrinsic has been damaged and the extrinsic has been damaged. So in a false aneurysm, which cascades would be triggered? In a false aneurysm, which cascades would be triggered?
Both.
Both intrinsic and extrinsic coagulation cascade. In athero, remember, I only damaged the inner layer. Do you guys see how that intrinsic can be independent? Okay, extrinsic, the only way to fire the extrinsic is if you actually bleed all the way out. If you have damage to both layers. So false aneurysm triggered both. Here's another question. If I fall and I scrape my knee on the pavement and I'm bleeding out of my knee, which cascades does that trigger? Notice I am bleeding out of my knee. That means blood's leaving my blood vessel.
Both.
Both. So false aneurysms, trauma, true aneurysms, anything that leads to outwardly bleeding, I am triggering both. Okay, if you are physically bleeding, that's going to trigger both. Okay. Now, the common classical, both intrinsic and extrinsic feed into this cascade. And the end product is fibrin. The end product is fibrin. When you finally have fibrin, that's when you have a clot. Okay. That's when you finally have a clot. So I'm going to kind of walk you guys through this here, but just knowing intrinsic coagulation cascade, extrinsic, and the classical. Okay. So walking through each one, starting with the intrinsic coagulation cascade. What was the trigger for your intrinsic cascade? What set this off?
Damage to the endothelium.
Exposing what?
Collagen.
Yeah. So let me kind of give you guys a hint. If you can remember this list, collagen, 12, 11, 9, 8, and 10. If you can remember this list in this order, you'll know the intrinsic cascade. Yes, I know how to count. There's a reason why it's out of order. Okay. So what I'm getting at here is with collagen, that's what's going to kick us all off. 12, 11, 9, 8, and 10. These are clotting factors. So this is clotting factor 12, clotting factor 11, clotting factor 9, clotting factor 8, clotting factor 10. Okay. These are clotting factors. All of these are in circulation right now. You are circulating clotting factor 12, 11, 9, 8, and 10 right now in your blood. Are you at risk for just throwing a random clot? No. Why? These clotting factors are inactive. These clotting factors are inactive. Okay. Clotting factor 12 will turn into clotting factor 12 activated when it touches collagen. So you have all these clotting factors circulating around in your blood. When clotting factor 12 touches the exposed collagen, that turns into 12 activated. Okay, if you guys notice, we've been calling it a cascade. So my question, what activates clotting factor 11 then?
Clotting factor 12.
Clotting factor 12 activated.
Yeah, correct.
Exactly. That's why we call it a cascade. Okay. Collagen activates clotting factor 12, becomes 12A. 12A activates 11, becomes 11A, all the way down to 10A. Now, yes, you need to know this. Why? It comes up in pharm. When you start talking about anticoagulants, talking about how this disrupts certain cascades. So yeah, sorry, you guys need to know these, okay? The other side note, here I'm using Arabic numerals. These are typically depicted with Roman numerals. So XII, XI, IX, okay? These are typically Roman numerals, but here I'm just keeping Arabic to keep it simple. So just a heads up about that, okay? So that is your intrinsic coagulation cascade. On the other side, you have your extrinsic. The nice thing about your extrinsic, it's pretty straightforward. Tissue factor, 7 and 10. That's it. Whole thing starts off with tissue factor, clotting factors 7 and 10. 7 becomes 7 activated when it meets tissue factor. 7 activated activates 10. Okay. So extrinsic's not so bad. Again, if you just remember the top part, your life will be so much easier. You can fill in the other stuff. Okay. The third cascade is the common/classical. Cascade. This one, no numbers, sorry. Starts with prothrombin. Do you guys remember what pro means? Like a prologue?
Beginning.
beginning or before. So prothrombin is before thrombin. Okay. Fibrinogen. Anytime you see ogen, ogen means inactive. Fibrinogen is inactive. What do you think activates fibrinogen?
Fibrin.
It activates into fibrin. Yep. But what activates it?
Thrombin.
Thrombin. Exactly. When we finally have fibrin, that is when we call it a clot. That is the last step. That is the end product. Okay. So let's kind of put this all together on one page. So you can kind of see how they all interact with one another. Okay. So if you didn't get the full thing before, it's okay. I'm going to write it out here. Intrinsic. Okay, with intrinsic, starts with collagen, 12, 11, 9, 8, and 10. Extrinsic. Tissue factor, 7 and 10. Okay. If you can remember that, you know this whole thing. Okay. So let's start, I guess I'll start with the intrinsic. Make it easy. We start with collagen. You have 12, 11, 9, 8, 10. 12 activated, 11 activated, 9 activated, 8 activated, 10 activated. Okay. Extrinsic. And common classical cascade. You have prothrombin to thrombin, fibrinogen into fibrin. Voila. Okay. So I know you guys are like mad dashing to write this down, but just hang tight. I promise I'll leave this up here, but I want to ask you guys a question about this, okay? So far, everything has had a trigger except for prothrombin turning into thrombin. What do you think activates prothrombin into thrombin?
Calcium.
Yes, you're not wrong, but that's you're like Miss Chloe. You just shot it out of the dark. That's a factor, yes, but there's another answer here. There's actually something else besides calcium.
The tissue factor 10A.
If you notice, all of them, either the intrinsic or the extrinsic, they both end in what?
10A.
Yes. That's why either one can feed into the common cascade. They both end in 10A. Therefore, what activates prothrombin into thrombin? 10A, whether that be from the intrinsic or the extrinsic. Okay, so those are your coagulation cascades. That is step 3. Now, I'll leave this here, I promise. I'm not gonna like rush you guys, but yeah, definitely try to get these down. Okay, unfortunately, it is just kind of memorization. Now, as you guys are working on this, what is an example of something that would trigger only the intrinsic cascade? What is an example pathology that only damages the inner layer of the blood vessel?
Atherosclerosis.
Atherosclerosis. That's really the only example. Okay. Now, when it comes to the intrinsic and the extrinsic, we know that the extrinsic does not fire on its own. But what is an example of something that would be both? Or what is an example of something that would trigger both intrinsic and extrinsic?
Aneurysm.
Aneurysm. What else?
Trauma of some sorts.
Yeah, trauma. Okay. Any sort of outward bleeding. Athero would be kind of like, I don't want to write that. That's going to make things weird. So just leave it at athero. Okay. So again, heads up, y'all. They use Roman numerals to describe it most of the time. Heads up. Okay. Now, thankfully, we've already kind of talked about this. Extrinsic is activated with tissue factor from damaged endothelial. It says endothelial. It should be damaged adventitia. Sorry, so just X through endothelial cells. Extrinsic pathways from damaged adventitia. Intrinsic activated with collagen. Okay, collagen in the endothelium. So, hey, you're intrinsic, you're extrinsic, common. Now, freaking Noe shooting it from downtown. Look at these yellow arrows. Where these yellow arrows are at, this is where you need calcium. Now, let me say you do not need to know the individual places in which calcium is important. You need to know overall, you need calcium to clot. Okay, you need calcium to clot. So recapping this whole thing, how do we stop bleeding? Step one, you vasospasm. So step one, vasospasm. Stop bleeding, decrease perfusion. Step two, that was your platelet plug. Okay, what did we need to activate your platelets? What do we need to activate the platelets?
Calcium and then the, I don't know, von Wall.
Yeah, and the von Willebrand factor. Nice. Step three was when you make your fibrin clot, when we start tying things down. It's like a cargo net. Okay, you have your intrinsic, you have your extrinsic. What did we need to activate any cascade?
Outward bleeding.
Outward bleeding would be extrinsic. Yes, that's half of it. What electrolyte did we need? It's the same as your platelets.
Calcium.
Calcium. So what I'm getting at is, hey, notice you need calcium in 2 of the 3 steps. calcium is vital to hemostasis in both steps 2 and 3. Okay. Drink your milk. Okay. So clot retraction. Hey, do you want to be clotted forever? Hopefully not. We'll just say like X through this part right here. Okay. So when we are done, we need to break up this clot. That's when we're going to undergo fibrinolysis. So fibrin, you know, that's associated with a clot. Lysis. Does anyone know what lysis means when something lyses?
Cutting something.
Perfect. Yeah, like your lysosomes, they cut. Or I'm going to use breakdown. Either one works. Okay. So this is how we break down clots. This is how we cut up clots. You need plasminogen and plasmin. What do you already know about plasminogen?
It comes before plasmin.
Comes before plasmin. Yep, kind of like pro. And if anything ends in ogen, what does that tell you? Like fibrinogen. It's inactive. So plasminogen, ogen means inactive. Therefore, you know, plasminogen is inactive, plasmin is active. Both of these are made at the liver. Okay. And D-dimers, this is going to be basically pieces of fibrin. Okay, so a little bit of an analogy time. Okay. So when you have fibrin, that's the equivalent to like a cargo net. Okay, so you use fibrin as a cargo net to tie everything down. Let's assume that you're moving and you're going to tie everything down to the top of your car. That fibrin is that cargo net. Does that make sense? Your chairs, your table, I don't know why you're doing this on top of your car, but your chairs, your table, your fancy ottoman, I don't know what your furniture situations is. All of that's tied together on top of your car via the fibrin, the cargo net. Make sense? Plasmin, this is the scissors. These are the scissors that you use to cut the cargo net. What happens when you start cutting the cargo net on the highway? What happens to all the stuff?
Shit's flying.
Shit's flying. That's exactly it. As soon as you start cutting this cargo net, your blood cells are going to go back into circulation. That's what your D-dimers are. Your D-dimers, these are the cut up pieces. Let me just say pieces. These are the cut pieces of the cargo net. So D-dimers are cut up bits of fibrin. Hopefully that helps you guys see what's going on there. So anybody working in the hospital or anyone been to the hospital, you might have heard D-dimers. I need you to find this patient's D-dimers. If you're looking for a patient's D-dimers, you're looking for little bits of fibrin. Why? Why would you want to know a patient's D-dimers?
Because that would signify that clots were being broken up in the body.
Why would they be breaking up clots? What did they form?
they formed the clots because they were bleeding somewhere.
Exactly. So when you're looking for D dimers, you're looking for an evidence of a clot. So let me give you an example. You remember how I told you about TIAs, transient ischemic attack, where I have a blood clot, it hits my brain, I lose the ability to talk, the clot moves on and I can talk again. So same situation. I'm sitting here, I'm talking at you, my face slumps, I start slurring my words, I pass out. I go to the hospital. I start talking again, I'm fine, I regain symmetry. You run a blood work and you find D dimers. That's your evidence to show you that I had a blood clot that caused my symptoms. You know it's a TIA. In a different situation, you run my blood work and you find no D dimers. That means it wasn't a clot that caused my symptoms. Maybe it was a seizure. Maybe it was something else. So you guys see what I'm saying is you use D dimers to look for evidence or history of a clot. Okay. So again, just showing you your fibrin here is your cargo net. Plasminogen is inactive. You activate it. It cuts these cargo nets into these little pieces. Those are your D dimers. Okay. How do you activate plasminogen into plasmin? Via these things here that you do not need to know. Okay, you don't need to worry about it. All you need to know comes from the liver, breaks up clots. Sound good? And that is Hemophys. Hooah! A little early. So, exam Monday. You got cardio, respiratory, right? Good luck in health assessment. I think your guys' exam you said was Wednesday, right? Wednesday, Thursday?
Thursday.
Thursday, okay, awesome. Good luck in your guys' health assessment this week. Go slow, IPPA, whole way. Yeah, so have a good weekend. Let me know if you guys have questions. Good luck studying. And yeah, I'll see you all Monday.
Hey, Bryant, can you go back to the hemostasis slide with the
Absolutely.
pathway?